Shares of AMD selling off nearly 4.5% in the after hours. We'll take a look at their Q3 results and see if the decline over the last 6 months in the shares of AMD can be bought up. As always, if you're new to the channel and find this type of content valuable, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button below. Shares of AMD over the past year are up nearly 50%, but in the after hours are selling off close to 4.5%. I've even seen as low as 5% in the after hours, trading closer to $94.27. This one was up close to 2.5% during the regular trade, but now seeing those gains reversed. Their Q3 results came in and revenues coming in at $5.8 billion for this Q3. That was up nearly 4% year over year and 8% quarter over quarter. Estimates on Wall Street were nearly at $5.69 billion, so a small beat on that top line revenues. And then EPS coming in at 70 cents. This is on a non-GAAP basis. So earnings per share coming in at 70 cents. Estimates were closer to 68 cents. So AMD beating on both the top and bottom line. We're taking a look at their quick P&L, but gross profits did rise nicely, up nearly 7%. You see the revenues were up nearly $200 million year over year, and then gross profits roughly in line with that, also up $200 million. So AMD doing an overall good job of controlling costs of those revenues. That allowed their gross margins to expand nearly 1% year over year. That was good to see. Now, operating expenses were up close to 12% year over year, up 6% on a quarter over quarter basis. AMD is investing heavily in R&D and their AI push. And so seeing these operating expenses expand, not a huge deal. They probably did a good job controlling costs on the marketing and G&A side. And so AMD spending on AI and R&D, certainly not a bad thing to see. I would be more concerned if operating expenses were down big and you see R&D down big over at AMD. That would be more concerning to me. You see operating income was roughly flat on a non-GAAP basis year over year and was up close to 19% quarter over quarter. So overall, a relatively flat quarter. You see revenues were up just 4% and then operating income came in flat. Now their net income was also up just 4% year over year, coming in at $1.13 billion. Now certain segments over at AMD are performing better than others. You see data center revenues were roughly flat on a year over year basis. Those came in at $1.6 billion. The operating income, however, in that segment was down close to 40% year over year. This is the segment, you come down here, you see data center segment, you see operating income was down substantially on a year over year basis. And AMD describes this primarily due to an increased R&D investment and to support future AI revenue growth and product mix. And so certainly, yeah, your revenues are flat, but the operating margins are down year over year because of that higher spend on the R&D and on AI. And so certainly not a bad thing to see over at AMD. This is an area where they're having to spend quite a bit right now on their R&D and AI mix in order to see returns down the road. And so certainly data center revenues flat, but operating income down roughly 40% year over year. But on the bright side, client net revenues were up close to 42%, those coming in at $1.45 billion. Last year, we were at just we'll call that flat $1 billion. And the operating income on that side also turning positive. You see, last year, we were running on an operating loss of close to $26 million. Now we are sitting on an operating income of roughly $140 million. That is close to a 600% jump year over year. Even quarter over quarter, we see last quarter, we were losing money on an operating basis on this client side revenues. Now we have turned over to an operating income. So that's certainly good to see. Client side revenues growing at 42%, but they are experiencing a slowdown in gaming and embedded demand. And so you see gaming revenues were down roughly 8%, coming in at $1.5 billion. Last year, we were closer to $1.63 billion. And then embedded revenues also down 5%, coming in at $1.24 billion. Last year, we were at $1.3 billion. So certain segments of AMD's business, such as gaming and embedded, struggling more so compared to the other segments of client and data center. They are having to invest heavily in this data center segment. And so even though revenues are flat, their operating incomes are down substantially year over year. But again, I wouldn't be overly concerned about this operating income being down so much. They are taking a hit in the near term on profitability. You see over the past few quarters, their EPS has taken a hit, but this is all in hopes of down the road that AI and R&D investment will pay off. You see their EPS is expected to rapidly increase over the subsequent 2 years. And so AMD having to invest heavily right now in order to see those gains down the road, especially on that AI side. Now, for their financial outlook for Q4 2023, this is likely what is sending shares down roughly 4% in the after hours now. Their revenue is expected to come in the range of $6.1 billion plus or minus $300 million. So on the low end, $5.8 billion, and then on the higher end, $6.4 billion. Wall Street had expectations closer to $6.4 billion. So AMD's forward-looking guidance coming in a bit shy on that midpoint at $6.1 billion. That would represent roughly 9% growth year over year and 5% quarter over quarter. Now, in my opinion, I think AMD does come in and sandbag numbers a little bit. They are one of those companies that come in and regularly beat estimates. And so it wouldn't be surprising if AMD does come in near the higher end of this range, closer to $6.4 billion. They just like to guide a bit lower and then come in and then beat those expectations. So in my opinion, I think AMD and analysts were spot on at $6.4 billion for this upcoming Q4. I do expect them to lower these projections for this upcoming Q4 and then AMD coming in and beating those expectations. Now, gross margins on this non-GAAP side is expected to come in at 51.5%. This quarter, we were sitting at just 51%, so a small increase quarter over quarter on those gross margins. I think year over year, that's roughly flat. And then operating expenses expected to be roughly at $1.74 billion. We were sitting at $1.7 billion in this most recent quarter, so slight increase on those operating expenses side. Overall, I think the financial outlook was relatively in line. They did come in near the lower end of expectations on that revenue side, but in my opinion, I think AMD will come in here and beat those. And so analysts are likely right, keeping their estimates at closer to $6.3 to $6.4 billion. Now, in terms of the balance sheet over at AMD, everything looking relatively consistent. Quarter over quarter, you see cash and cash equivalents were down roughly 8%, not a huge amount. They're sitting at roughly $5.78 billion worth of cash and cash equivalents. Accounts receivable, you see those ticked up roughly 17%. The important number, in my opinion, on the AMD balance sheet is inventories. You see those were roughly down 3% quarter over quarter. And so not a huge change in inventories. Suddenly, if you see this number tick up, that would be a bad sign, in my opinion. I would like to see inventories remain roughly flat and hopefully go down, especially in this upcoming Q4 after the holiday sell through. You see total debt roughly flat year over year at $2.5 billion. So all things considered on AMD's balance sheet, nothing too overly concerning. Moving on to the technical analysis for AMD. Now in the after hours, I'm seeing this roughly flat. And so this one is chopping around in the after hours. Yeah, up close to 10-15 basis points. And so we'll see where this one trades out tomorrow. Last time we did a video on AMD was on their last earnings. Shares were trading closer to $120 per share. Now I can likely bring this resistance line closer to, I want to call it $100, as that's likely the next point where AMD will hit its head. Right now trading closer to $98. And so certainly not a huge difference between its closest resistance. Now, in my opinion, I think this sell-off can be a great place to come in and accumulate shares of AMD. No doubt it got overextended on this rally back in May and April of this year when it reached close to $130 per share. AMD does tend to make these staircases up and staircases down. As you see back last year, it had a monster decline, but took a number of breaks on that way down. And so again, AMD making this downtrending channel in the near term over the past 6 months, you can likely draw in this line in a number of different ways, probably move it up slightly as well. And so anytime AMD comes under $100, I think it's worth considering to be a buy, considering how many tailwinds, long-term tailwinds, that being AI is really playing in AMD's favor. Certainly it is a big beneficiary of this AI wave, likely second to NVIDIA, but still will benefit quite a bit from AI. And especially if you are bullish, even on gaming over the long term, yeah, AMD will absolutely benefit from tailwinds in the gaming sector. Certainly, again, under 100, I think you can absolutely consider picking up shares of AMD. Again, I wouldn't go all in on a position in AMD at once. I would come in here and nibble on shares, possibly at 100. Anytime it comes below $90, I think for a long-term buy and hold, yeah, that can absolutely be a great point to accumulate shares of AMD. And then I think anywhere under $80, really for the short and long term, I think that would be a great buy. And so I would consider coming in here and picking up shares of AMD, especially if it does sell off tomorrow. It was closer to $94. Certainly if it can sell off back down to $94, that is a place where you can come in here, maybe pick up 1 or 2 shares. And then if it heads lower, a second level of support I see closer to $90. That is where you can come in here and pick up maybe 1 or 2 shares of AMD. And then below that, again, if it keeps heading lower, I think AMD is a position you can slowly build out on the way down, on staircases down like this. You can come in here and buy 1 or 2 shares at really every way down. And if it comes down underneath $80, you can get more aggressive the lower it gets. Below $80 is certainly a place where I would be more aggressive in picking up shares of AMD. But again, even on the way up, if it makes these staircases up back to $84, you can still come in there, pick up a share or 2. And then over $100, I would slow my purchasing of AMD down by a lot. I think the risk reward really comes in underneath $100 for this stock. And so really under $90 is where I would be interested in picking up shares of AMD. And again, you can build this position out slowly over a long period of time. This is not a stock that will suddenly shoot to the moon tomorrow, but as well on the downside, it likely won't see a big fall off a cliff like you have seen in a lot of other stocks. This one tends to make these staircase moves down and up, and I think that is where you can come in here and accumulate a position in AMD. Certainly this can be one of those stocks that can be a big position in your portfolio. This is a very good AI beneficiary play and sees other long-term tailwinds, that being in gaming and data center. That was my take on AMD. Overall, a relatively strong quarter. The guidance coming in a bit light, but I think that is AMD just sandbagging a little bit and then hoping to come in here and beat analyst expectations in Q4. I think this is a company you can absolutely buy and hold on to. Let me know your thoughts on AMD in the comment section below. Are you coming here and picking up shares at $98? Stay tuned on the channel for more earnings later on this week, including Apple on Thursday. As always, thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.